courtroom falls silent in a small southern town in the 1890s as a black man stands alone before a judge, his wrists bound, his fate already decided long before any evidence is heard, because the accusation against him is not theft, not murder, but something more explosive in the racial imagination of the era, impropriety toward a white woman. And in that silence, you can feel the weight of centuries pressing down, because this moment did not begin here. It began on plantations decades earlier, inside households where law, race, and gender fused into a structure that left enslaved men utterly defenseless against the word of those who owned them. Stay with this story, because by the end, you will understand how power operated not only through chains and fields, but through accusation, how legal systems and cultural mythologies intertwined, and how the intersection of race and gender shaped violence from slavery through Jim Crow, not as rumor, not as exaggeration, but as documented history written in court transcripts, plantation ledgers, and federal investigations. Under the slave codes of the American South, enslaved people were legally property. That status erased legal standing. An enslaved man could not testify against a white person in many jurisdictions. He could not file charges. He could not defend himself in court if accused by someone recognized as legally superior. The law itself constructed a hierarchy in which race defined credibility and property status defined vulnerability. Inside that structure, white women occupied a complicated position, subordinate within patriarchal society, yet elevated above enslaved people through race and legal privilege. In slaveholding households, white women often inherited enslaved laborers, managed domestic staff, and in some cases oversaw discipline. Probate records, wills, and estate inventories list white women as slaveholders in their own right. Economic documentation shows women buying, selling, and managing enslaved people, not merely as passive observers, but as actors within the system. This reality disrupts simplistic narratives. White women in the antebellum South were constrained by gender norms, denied political rights, and legally subordinate to husbands under coverture. Yet within slave society, race conferred authority. An enslaved man interacting with a white woman did so within a rigid code that assumed his inferiority and her presumed virtue. That presumption carried deadly consequences. Plantation records and post-emancipation testimonies reveal that enslaved men accused of insolence, disobedience, or sexual impropriety could face whipping, sale, mutilation, or death. Evidence was rarely required in a modern sense. The word of a white household member, especially a white woman, carried institutional weight. Courts did not function as neutral arenas for enslaved defendants. They functioned as guardians of property and racial order. Even suspicion could be enough. The structure did not need constant accusations to sustain fear. The possibility alone reinforced control. At the same time, enslaved men lived within close physical proximity to white households, working as domestic servants, drivers, craftsmen, stable hands. That proximity created daily interaction under conditions of extreme inequality. Any perceived breach of racial etiquette could be framed as threat. The ideology of white womanhood, fragile, pure, in need of protection, developed alongside the ideology of black male danger. During slavery, that ideology served discipline. After slavery, it would become a public weapon. But it's crucial to understand that during the slave era, the greatest documented pattern of sexual exploitation ran in the opposite direction. White men exploiting enslaved women with impunity. That imbalance of power shaped the entire racialized sexual mythology of the South. Yet paradoxically, even as white male sexual violence was embedded in slavery, the image that gained cultural force was the alleged threat posed by black men to white women. That image did not arise spontaneously after emancipation. It was incubated within a society structured by fear, control, and racial hierarchy. Enslaved men had no recognized right to protect their reputations. They had no presumption of innocence when confronting white accusers. In some cases, accusations appear in court records tied to disputes over discipline or resistance. In others, the details are fragmentary, preserved only through later testimony collected in the WPA slave narratives or referenced in county archives. What remains consistent across sources is the legal imbalance. The word of a white person outweighed the life of an enslaved man. Inside plantation households, authority could be exercised in complex ways. Some white women participated directly in discipline. Others deferred to overseers or husbands. Some accounts describe harsh punishment ordered by mistresses. Others describe white women intervening to prevent brutality. The historical record is not monolithic. It reveals variation, contradiction, and human complexity. But what does not vary is the structural fact that enslaved men possessed no legal shield against accusation from those above them in the racial hierarchy. When the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, legal status changed. But the mythology did not disappear. Emancipation upended the old order, granting formerly enslaved men citizenship and, for a brief period during Reconstruction, political participation. Black men voted, held office, and exercised rights unimaginable a decade earlier. For many white Southerners, this shift represented not merely political change, but social inversion. The old hierarchy had cracked, and it was in that atmosphere of upheaval that accusations involving white women began to carry new, explosive power. During Reconstruction, and especially after federal troops withdrew in 1877, thousands of black men were lynched across the South. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented more than 4,000 racial terror lynchings between 1877 and 1950. In many cases, newspapers justified these killings by alleging assault, attempted assault, or impropriety toward white women. Sometimes the accusations were detailed. Often they were vague. Evidence was rarely tested in court. Mobs replaced trials. The mythology of the black male predator became central to the justification of racial violence. White womanhood was portrayed as under siege, and lynching was framed as defense. Yet investigative journalism, congressional records, and later historical analysis reveal that many lynchings stemmed from economic disputes, political competition, labor conflicts, or minor social infractions. The allegation of sexual misconduct became a pretext powerful enough to mobilize mobs and silence dissent. The pattern reveals continuity with slavery's legal imbalance. During slavery, accusation from a white household member could result in punishment without due process. After emancipation, accusation, or even rumor, could ignite extrajudicial killing. The setting shifted from plantation yard to public square. The mechanism shifted from overseer's whip to mob violence. But the intersection of race, gender, and credibility remained. Newspapers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often sensationalized alleged crimes involving white women and black men, inflaming public fear. Anti-lynching activists such as Ida B. Wells documented case after case where the narrative of assault masked other motives. Federal investigations gathered data, but failed repeatedly to secure national anti-lynching legislation. Bills were introduced in Congress. They were blocked. The federal government documented violence, yet declined to intervene decisively for decades. This history cannot be reduced to individual morality tales. It is about systems, legal codes that once denied enslaved men testimony rights, cultural ideologies that elevated white female virtue as sacred, and post-emancipation power structures that weaponized accusation to restore racial control. It is about how patriarchy and white supremacy reinforced one another, placing white women in a paradoxical role, constrained within male-dominated society, yet empowered within racial hierarchy. And at the center of it stood men whose lives could hinge on a word. From plantation discipline to Reconstruction-era terror, the arc reveals not a simple story of personal cruelty, but a documented evolution of power, where accusation, protected by racial credibility and gendered mythology, could determine survival itself. To understand how that mythology hardened into one of the most lethal narratives in American history, you have to follow it beyond the courtroom and into the public square, where crowds gathered not for trials, but for spectacle. A crowd gathers beneath a courthouse balcony in 1919, hats tilted back, faces lifted toward a window, where a young black man is being held. And somewhere in that crowd, a rumor spreads faster than fact. A white woman has made an accusation, and before the sun sets, the jail will be stormed. The man dragged into the street, and justice will no longer belong to a courtroom but to the mob. Because by this point, the mythology is fully armed, fully public, and fully lethal. What began inside plantation hierarchies as a legal imbalance has now become a cultural reflex. And to understand how that transformation happened, you have to trace how the image of white womanhood and the fear of black male sexuality were reshaped after emancipation into one of the most powerful weapons in American racial history. During slavery, the plantation functioned as a closed system. Punishment was internal. Discipline was immediate. Accusations did not require public justification. They required only property control. But once slavery ended, and black men became citizens under the 14th Amendment, the old mechanisms of control fractured. Black men voted. They served in legislatures. They owned land. They testified in court. For many white Southerners, particularly those invested in restoring racial hierarchy, this shift was intolerable. Political dominance had been disrupted. Labor systems were unstable. The former property now stood as legal equals, at least on paper. In this volatile atmosphere, racial mythology hardened. The idea of the black male as a sexual threat to white women did not suddenly appear in 1877. It evolved from earlier codes of racial separation and fear. But during Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow, it became central to a new narrative, that white civilization itself was endangered. Newspapers amplified allegations, often without evidence. Headlines inflamed communities before investigations could occur. Courts sometimes attempted trials, but mobs frequently intervened first. Between the late 19th and mid-20th centuries, thousands of black men were lynched across the South, and a significant portion of those killings were publicly justified as retaliation for alleged sexual misconduct. The documentation is overwhelming. County archives, coroner's reports, newspaper clippings preserved in collections like Without Sanctuary, congressional debates over anti-lynching legislation, the equal justice initiatives county-by-county mapping of racial terror. Patterns emerge clearly. Accusations were often vague, evidence thin, motives entangled with labor disputes, political competition, or economic resentment. Yet the mere suggestion of impropriety involving a white woman could override due process entirely. And here the intersection of race and gender becomes painfully complex. White women in the Jim Crow South were positioned as symbols of purity and vulnerability, their bodies invoked as justification for racial control. Patriarchal culture elevated them as objects to be protected, often by white men who wielded violence in their name. But white women were not always passive figures in these events. In some cases, accusations were later recanted. In others, they were fabricated under social pressure. In still others, consensual relationships were redefined as assault to avoid violating anti-miscegenation laws that criminalized interracial intimacy. The law itself reinforced the mythology. Anti-miscegenation statutes criminalized relationships between black men and white women regardless of consent. Courts treated such relationships as inherently illicit. A consensual encounter could be reframed as coercion because racial codes denied the legitimacy of black male agency in white female spaces. This legal architecture ensured that accusation did not operate in a vacuum. It operated within a framework designed to preserve racial boundaries. Lynching functioned not merely as punishment, but as spectacle. Crowds gathered, photographs were taken, postcards were printed, violence became communal ritual, and at the center of the justification was the protection of white womanhood. The accusation, whether substantiated or not, transformed individual grievance into collective rage. It reasserted racial dominance in the most brutal way possible. Yet even amid this terror, there were cracks in the narrative. Investigative journalists like Ida B. Wells exposed inconsistencies, revealing cases where lynching victims had been economically successful, politically active, or simply accused without proof. Federal records show repeated attempts to pass anti-lynching legislation, bills introduced, debated, and ultimately blocked by Southern lawmakers who defended states' rights. The federal government documented atrocities but failed for decades to intervene decisively. The through line from slavery to Jim Crow is not identical in mechanism, but it is unmistakable in structure. During slavery, an enslaved man's fate could hinge on the word of a white household member because he possessed no legal standing. After emancipation, a black man's fate could hinge on public accusation because the legal system, though theoretically equal, was undermined by racial bias and mob enforcement. The arena changed. The vulnerability endured. It is essential to recognize that this history does not flatten individuals into caricatures. White women in the South lived within patriarchal constraints, denied political power until 1920, shaped by cultural expectations of purity and dependence. Many did not participate in accusations. Some opposed violence. Some became activists in later civil rights struggles. But within the racial order of the time, the symbolic power assigned to white womanhood carried lethal consequences when mobilized against black men. By the early 20th century, the mythology had become embedded in American culture, reinforced by literature, film, and political rhetoric. It justified segregation. It justified disenfranchisement. It justified terror. The accusation became shorthand for restoring order whenever that order felt threatened. And still, behind each case lay a human story. A man pulled from a jail cell before dawn. A family watching from a distance, powerless. A town that would later insist it had defended its honor. The official narrative spoke of protection. The archival record reveals control. From plantation yard to courthouse balcony to lynching tree. The evolution reveals how accusation moved from private enforcement to public spectacle. How race and gender were braided into a myth strong enough to override law itself. To understand how this myth would eventually be challenged, exposed, and documented as national shame, you have to step into the era when federal investigators began collecting evidence not to enforce terror, but to confront it, and when the story of accusation began to face its own reckoning. In the 1930s, as the Great Depression hollowed out towns across America and federal power expanded in response to economic collapse, investigators began compiling reports that read like indictments of a nation unwilling to confront itself, documenting lynchings in cold bureaucratic language, date, county, alleged offense, number of participants. And when you read those files, you realize that what mobs called justice, the federal government quietly recorded as failure, because case after case revealed that accusations involving white women were invoked to justify violence long before evidence could ever be weighed. The pattern had become so predictable that anti-lynching activists could chart it. A rumor circulates. Newspapers amplify it. Crowds gather. Officials hesitate or step aside, and the accused rarely survives the night. Ida B. Wells had already begun this documentation decades earlier, traveling, interviewing, publishing meticulous rebuttals to the claim that lynching was a defense of white womanhood. She exposed cases where relationships were consensual but rebranded as assault once discovered, cases where economic competition sparked resentment, cases where political participation by black men preceded sudden allegations. Her work revealed something destabilizing. The mythology was not merely spontaneous panic, but a tool repeatedly activated to maintain racial hierarchy. By the early 20th century, the narrative had grown institutional roots. Films like The Birth of a Nation reinforced the image of the black male predator and glorified vigilante response. Political speeches invoked protection of white women as moral duty. Segregation laws hardened. Courts rarely punished lynchers. Even when federal investigations gathered overwhelming evidence, Southern senators blocked anti-lynching legislation again and again, invoking states' rights as shield. The failure was not accidental, it was systemic. Yet as the decades passed, cracks widened. World War II forced America to confront the contradiction between fighting fascism abroad and tolerating racial terror at home. Black veterans returned demanding rights they defended overseas. The civil rights movement began to gather force. Photographs of lynchings that once circulated as trophies began to circulate as evidence of brutality. Public opinion shifted gradually, painfully. And in this shift, the mythology itself faced scrutiny. Court transcripts were revisited. Journalists re-examined cases. Historians traced the evolution of racialized sexual panic back through Reconstruction and into slavery's legal framework. They identified how slave codes denied testimony, how anti-miscegenation laws criminalized intimacy, how white womanhood had been constructed as both fragile and politically potent within a white supremacist system. The accusation, once treated as sacred truth, was revealed as part of a broader architecture of control. None of this erases the reality that crimes occurred in history, nor does it deny that women could be victims of violence. But the documented pattern shows that the rhetoric of protection was disproportionately mobilized against black men in ways that bypassed due process and legitimized terror. The imbalance was measurable. The consequences were fatal. By the late 20th century, formal lynching had largely disappeared, but the legacy of the myth endured in subtler forms. In courtroom biases, in media narratives, in disproportionate sentencing patterns. Scholars analyzing criminal justice data found echoes of earlier dynamics. Credibility weighted unevenly, suspicion racialized, stereotypes lingering beneath legal language. The structure had evolved, but its foundations were traceable. Today, memorials stand in places where mobs once gathered. The Equal Justice Initiative's National Memorial for Peace and Justice lists names county by county, transforming what was once local spectacle into national reckoning. Congressional apologies have been issued for failure to pass anti-lynching laws. Archives once buried are now digitized, searchable, undeniable. When you step back and view the arc from slavery through Jim Crow into modern reckoning, the pattern clarifies. Power operated through law when it could, through accusation when it needed to, and through spectacle when it sought to intimidate. White women in this history were neither a monolith nor merely bystanders. They were positioned within a patriarchal racial system that amplified their voices against black men, while simultaneously restricting their own autonomy in other domains. The complexity resists simplification, but the structure remains visible. A single accusation during slavery could lead to whipping or sale because the enslaved man had no legal standing. A single accusation during Jim Crow could lead to lynching because the legal system refused to protect him. Across eras, the vulnerability of black men to racially charged allegations reveals how race and gender were weaponized together. And as the nation continues to examine its past, the dark truth is not simply about individual cruelty. It is about how institutions codified imbalance, how culture sanctified myth, and how silence allowed violence to masquerade as protection for generations. The story does not end in the courthouse balcony or beneath the lynching tree. It ends in archives opened, in names spoken aloud, in a reckoning that insists accusation alone is never justice. In the decades after World War II, when television cameras began to carry images of racial violence into living rooms across America, something irreversible began to happen. The mythology that had once operated with near total impunity was forced into the light, and once exposed to scrutiny, it began to fracture under its own contradictions. Courtrooms that once leaned reflexively toward racial presumption faced growing federal oversight. Journalists revisited cases long buried in county archives. Civil rights attorneys challenged jury exclusions, coerced confessions, and fabricated narratives that had thrived in earlier eras. But exposure did not mean immediate transformation. In the mid-20th century, Accusations involving white women still carried disproportionate weight in Southern courtrooms. All-white juries remained common. Prosecutors leaned into familiar fears. Defense attorneys often faced intimidation, even when lynching declined. The death penalty and lengthy prison sentences became tools through which racial imbalance could continue within the bounds of formal legality. The spectacle moved from the town square to the courtroom, but the emotional charge attached to racialized sexual allegations did not vanish overnight. At the same time, women's roles within society were evolving. White women gained suffrage in 1920. Post-war economic shifts opened new public spaces. Feminist movements later challenged patriarchal constraints that had once framed white womanhood as fragile property to be guarded. As those cultural shifts unfolded, the old narrative of unquestioned protection began to lose coherence. The idea that white women existed primarily as symbols within a racial hierarchy started to face challenge not only from civil rights activists, but from women themselves demanding autonomy beyond protective mythology. Scholars began analyzing how white supremacy and patriarchy had functioned together, not always harmoniously, but symbiotically. The myth of the black male predator had simultaneously elevated white women as sacred symbols and limited them to roles defined by male guardianship. Within that system, accusations could become instruments of racial enforcement, but the structure itself confined everyone inside it, albeit in radically unequal ways. Recognizing that complexity does not dilute the violence inflicted on black men, it reveals how deeply embedded the system was in cultural imagination. Federal legislation eventually shifted legal frameworks. Civil rights laws dismantled formal segregation. Voting protections altered political power structures. Supreme Court rulings strengthened defendants' rights. Yet long after those reforms, studies of sentencing disparities and jury bias continued to show uneven outcomes when race intersected with allegations of sexual misconduct. The shadow of the old mythology lingered, and so the reckoning expanded beyond legal reform into historical memory. Universities, museums, and public memorials began cataloging lynching victims by name. Counties confronted their own records. Families traced ancestors lost to mob violence. Photographs once circulated as trophies were recontextualized as evidence of terror. The narrative of protection was steadily replaced by documentation of control. In this broader reckoning, the story that began on plantations with legal vulnerability and household authority revealed its full arc. From private discipline to public spectacle, from slave code to mob rule, to biased prosecution, from whispered accusation to headline justification. It was never about a singular type of woman or a singular type of man. It was about how race and gender were organized within a hierarchy that granted credibility unevenly and enforced that imbalance with force. When you revisit that silent courtroom at the beginning of this story, you can now see what stood behind it. Centuries of legal precedent denying testimony, decades of newspaper sensationalism, political leaders unwilling to confront mobs, cultural myths rehearsed so often they felt natural. The man standing before the judge was not only facing a charge, he was facing an inherited narrative. The dark truth is not merely that accusations happened. It is that systems were designed to decide whose word counted and whose life could be sacrificed when tension rose. It is that credibility itself was racialized. It is that protection invoked in the name of virtue often concealed domination. Today, when historians analyze this history, they do so with documentation, plantation ledgers, court transcripts, congressional debates, investigative journalism, not to inflame, but to clarify. Because clarity is the only antidote to myth. And if there is a final image that remains, it is not of a mob or a gavel, but of records reopened, names restored, and a society gradually learning that justice cannot rest on accusation alone, nor on narratives shaped by fear. The intersection of race, gender, and law that once fueled terror now stands exposed in archives and memorials, demanding understanding rather than silence. What began as imbalance inside a plantation household evolved into one of the most devastating narratives in American history, an understanding that evolution is part of dismantling its legacy. At the turn of the 20th century, postcards were printed with smiling crowds beneath hanging bodies, mailed across state lines as souvenirs. And if you hold one of those images in your mind long enough, you begin to understand that this was never only about individual accusation. It was about a society that normalized the spectacle of punishment when race and gender intersected in the wrong direction. A society that converted rumor into ritual and called it protection. And the final reckoning of this history does not rest in a single courtroom or a single decade. It rests in how long the narrative endured, how deeply it shaped institutions, and how fiercely it resisted correction. By the time the federal government formally apologized in 2005 for failing to pass anti-lynching legislation, More than a century had passed since the peak of racial terror. Thousands of documented lynchings had occurred. Countless trials had been bypassed. Generations had grown up inside a culture where the allegation of impropriety toward a white woman could override evidence, override testimony, override life itself. The apology acknowledged failure, but it could not undo the imbalance written into history. What makes this story so powerful and so uncomfortable is that it exposes the mechanics of credibility. During slavery, enslaved men were denied the right to testify against white accusers. During Jim Crow, black defendants faced all-white juries predisposed to believe narratives that aligned with racial myth. Even in later eras, statistical analyses reveal disparities in sentencing and jury outcomes when race intersects with sexual allegations. The structure changed shape over time, but the core question lingered: whose voice is believed first? And here's where the complexity must remain intact. White women were not a unified force acting in coordination. They were individuals living within a patriarchal order that simultaneously constrained and empowered them depending on context. Some accusations were genuine, some were false, some were coerced by male relatives or community pressure, some were entangled in consensual relationships rendered criminal by anti-miscegenation laws. The documentary record demands precision, not simplification, but the pattern is clear enough to trace. The image of endangered white womanhood became a central justification for maintaining racial hierarchy. It mobilized mobs, it influenced juries, it shaped legislation, it fueled films, political speeches, and segregationist rhetoric. It allowed violence to masquerade as virtue. The final reckoning of this history lies not in condemnation alone, but in exposure, in understanding how legal systems once denied testimony based on race, how newspapers amplified fear, how federal authorities hesitated to intervene, how communities normalized terror through ritual and spectacle. It lies in recognizing that power often hides behind moral language. Today, memorials list the names of lynching victims in steel columns engraved by county. Scholars digitize archives once buried in courthouse basements. Students read congressional debates where anti-lynching bills were filibustered into silence. The silence itself becomes evidence. The absence of intervention becomes part of the story. And when you step back across the full arc, from plantation yards where enslaved men had no legal standing, to Reconstruction courts where due process crumbled, to Jim Crow mobs invoking protection, to modern memorials confronting terror, you see a continuous thread, accusation functioning within a system that had already decided whose life carried less weight. The dark truth is not that all white women acted maliciously. It is that the system amplified certain voices over others, codified that amplification into law, and enforced it through violence. It is that race and gender were braided together in a hierarchy that proved lethal when challenged. In the end, what remains is not the spectacle, but the record. Names written where silence once stood. Court transcripts re-examined. Photographs reframed not as trophies, but as testimony. The power of myth weakened by documentation. The story closes not with a mob or a gavel, but with a question that echoes beyond its era. What happens when fear is given legal authority and credibility is assigned by race? History answers that question in painful detail, and understanding that answer is part of ensuring it is never written the same way again.